The three things that are always true. Whether or not the Buddha ever existed, these three things were already true. He didn't invent them. He looked carefully enough to see them. Then he pointed. 25 centuries later, we call them the three characteristics of existence, as though the Buddha sat down one afternoon and composed a list. But here is something most people never learn. The Buddha never used that phrase. Not once. The compound tilakkhana, three characteristics, does not appear anywhere in the Pali Canon. What he actually spoke of were three perceptions, three trained ways of seeing experience clearly, three observations deployed for a purpose. The difference matters. Tonight, what those three observations are, what they reveal when you hold them together, and why seeing them clearly, not believing them, seeing them, changes everything. Chapter 1. The Anicca and the Antidotes. There is a short sutta, barely a page, that may be the most quietly radical passage in all of Buddhist literature. It appears in the Anguttara Nikaya as Sutta 3.136. Though if you use Thanissaro Bhikkhu's numbering on dhammatalks.org, you will find it listed as AN 3:137, and in older editions of Access to Insight as AN 3.134. Three numbers, one sutta. What matters is what it says. The Buddha states, whether or not there is the arising of Tathāgatas, this property stands, this steadfastness of the Dhamma, this orderliness of the Dhamma. All fabrications are inconstant. A. N. 3.136. He then repeats the same formula for the second observation. All fabrications are stressful. And the third, all phenomena are not self, but it is the verbs that deserve your attention. Listen to what the sutta says the Tathāgata does with these truths. He directly awakens to that, breaks through to that, directly awakening and breaking through to that. He declares it, teaches it, describes it, sets it forth. He reveals it, explains it, makes it plain. AN 3.136. 7 verbs. Every single one is a verb of disclosure. Not one is a verb of creation. The Buddha declares, he teaches, he describes, he sets forth, he reveals, he explains, he makes plain. He does not invent, he does not legislate, he does not compose. This is an extraordinary claim, and it is the Buddha's own claim about himself. He is saying that whether or not he ever appeared in the world, these three observations would still hold. They are not Buddhist insights in the way a theorem is Euclidean or a theory is Darwinian. They are structural regularities. The Pali word is niyama, an orderliness built into the nature of things that any mind, looking carefully enough, would eventually see. The Buddha simply looked more carefully than most, and then he told people what he saw. This matters because it changes what you are being asked to do tonight. You are not being asked to adopt 3 Buddhist doctrines. You are being asked to consider 3 observations about the nature of experience. Observations the Buddha himself said existed before him and would continue after him. And to check them against what you already know, because you already know something about all 3. You have watched impermanence. You have felt the stress of clinging. You may have suspected, in certain unguarded moments, that the self you defend so vigorously is less solid than it appears. The question is not whether you have glimpsed these things. The question is whether you have looked at them long enough and steadily enough for the looking to change something. Before we examine what the 3 perceptions reveal, we need to understand the problem they solve. Because the Buddha did not offer these observations into a vacuum. He offered them as medicine. And the disease has a name. In the Anguttara Nikaya, Sutta 4.49, the Buddha describes 4 vipallasa, 4 distortions, 4 inversions of how the untrained mind reads experience. A. N. 4.49. The first distortion, perceiving what is inconstant as constant. The second, perceiving what is stressful as pleasant. The third, perceiving what is not self as self. The fourth, perceiving what is unattractive as attractive. 3 of these 4 map exactly onto the 3 perceptions. This is not a coincidence. The 3 perceptions are not 3 new doctrines to adopt. They are 3 antidotes, corrective lenses designed to reverse 3 specific misreadings that the mind makes constantly, automatically, and without your permission. And the distortions do not stay at one level. The sutta describes 3 layers. First, saññā vipallasa, a distortion of raw perception. The mind registers constant before you have time to think. Then, citta vipallasa, a distortion of thought. You build plans, expectations, and entire life architecture on top of that initial misreading. Finally, ditthi vipallasa, a distortion of view. The misreading hardens into a worldview, a philosophy, an unexamined assumption so deep you mistake it for reality itself. Perception feeds thought. Thought solidifies into view. View reinforces perception. The loop closes, and you live inside it. Reading permanent, where things change. Pleasant, where things bite. Mine, where nothing holds still long enough to be owned. This is the condition the 3 perceptions are designed to interrupt. Not by giving you 3 new beliefs to replace the old ones, but by training the mind to see through 3 beliefs it adopted so early and so completely that they feel like the texture of reality rather than interpretations laid over it. Now, you may have noticed something. None of what we have discussed so far is uniquely Buddhist in its raw observation. The Greek philosopher Heraclitus, 5 centuries before Christ, noticed that you cannot step into the same river twice. Modern physics has confirmed, down to the subatomic level, that nothing in the material world holds still. These are not controversial claims, but here is where the Buddha's contribution begins to separate from mere observation. Heraclitus noticed the river. The physicist measures the particles. The Buddha asked a different question. What happens to a mind that clings to what the river carries away? That question, not the observation of change, but the investigation of what clinging to change does, is where the 3 perceptions begin. And it is where we turn next, because the Buddha did not simply point at impermanence, suffering, and not self as 3 separate facts. In one remarkable sutta, he sat with 5 monks and walked them through a sequence of questions. And by the time the questions were finished, all 5 were free. Chapter 2. The Logical Sequence. The sutta is called the anatta, the discourse on the characteristic of not self, and it is the second formal teaching the Buddha ever gave. NN 22.59. The first, delivered the day before, had laid out the 4 noble truths. That discourse convinced the 5 ascetics that the Buddha had found something real. This second discourse did something else. It set them free. The setting matters. These 5 men had practiced severe austerities with the future Buddha for years. When he abandoned asceticism for the middle way, they abandoned him in disgust. They thought he had gone soft. Now he had returned, awakened. They were beginning to suspect. And he was about to dismantle the last thing they were still holding on to. The Buddha begins with an argument about control. Form is not self, he says. If form were the self, this form would not lend itself to dis-ease. It would be possible to say with regard to form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. But precisely because form is not self, form lends itself to dis-ease, and it is not possible to say with regard to form, let my form be thus, let my form not be thus. SN 22.59. He repeats this for feeling, for perception, for mental fabrications, for consciousness. 5 aggregates, 5 times the same surgical observation. If this were truly yours, you could control it. You cannot. Therefore, it is not yours in the way you believe it to be. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is an empirical test. Try it. Tell your body not to age. Tell your feelings to remain pleasant. Tell your mind to stop producing thoughts you did not invite. The inability is not a failure of willpower. It is evidence. But the Buddha does not stop there. The control argument is only the foundation. What follows is one of the most carefully constructed sequences of questions in all of ancient literature. What do you think, monks? Is form constant or inconstant? Inconstant, Lord. And is that which is inconstant easeful or stressful? Stressful, Lord. And is it fitting to regard what is inconstant, stressful, subject to change as, this is mine, this is myself, this is what I am? No, Lord. SN 22.59. The same 3 questions applied to all 5 aggregates, and the argument moves in one direction only. Notice the chain. The first question establishes impermanence. Is this constant or inconstant? The answer is observational. Anyone watching experience carefully arrives here. The second question draws out the implication. Is what changes easeful or stressful? Not in itself. Change is neutral. But for a mind that grips, what changes is always stressful, because the grip will always be broken. The third question completes the sequence. Given that this changes, and given that clinging to what changes generates stress, is it fitting to call this mine, myself, what I am? The monks say no. And the no is not intellectual assent. It is recognition. This is why the 3 perceptions are better understood as one insight seen from 3 depths. Impermanence is the observation. Unsatisfactoriness is the consequence. What happens when a mind that wants permanence meets a world that does not provide it? Not self is the deepest implication. The recognition that the one doing the clinging is itself part of what changes. Anatta is not a third doctrine added to a list. It is derived. It follows from the first 2, the way a conclusion follows from premises, because impermanent. Because clinging to the impermanent generates stress. Because no stable self can be found in what keeps changing. And the self that seemed to be doing the searching was itself among the things that change. 1 motion, 3 depths. The Sutta's argument moves this way, and it has moved this way for 25 centuries of careful reading. A note of honesty here. The reading I have just offered, 1 insight, 3 angles, is editorially supported by the structure of SN 22.59. The Catechism does move from anicca to dukkha to anatta in a deductive chain, but the Buddha never explicitly states, in so many words, that anatta is derived from anicca and dukkha. The deduction is structural, not declared. I present it as the Sutta's argument because that is what the structure shows, but I flag it as a reading, a very old and very well supported reading, rather than a direct quotation. What is not a reading, what is simply what the text says, is what happened next. When this explanation was being given, the hearts of the group of 5 monks, through not clinging, were fully released from effluence. S. N. and 22.59. 5 men, 1 conversation, 1 sequence of questions they could answer for themselves, and release. 26 centuries of commentary have been written about this moment. Libraries of interpretation, schools of philosophy. The sutta itself says it took 1 sitting. The 5 monks did not need the commentary. They needed to see clearly what was in front of them. and the Buddha's questions were precise enough to make the seeing possible. The chain makes sense as argument, but each link carries weight. The argument alone does not show. Impermanence is not just a logical premise. It is the texture of a life in which everything you love will change form. Unsatisfactoriness is not just a middle term. It is the ache you feel when you understand that sentence. And not self is not just a conclusion. It is the most disorienting and most liberating recognition a human mind can make. Each deserves to be examined on its own terms. Chapter 3. The Three, each in depth one. Anicca, what changes? There is a verse in the Dhammapada, verse 277, that reframes everything most people think they know about impermanence. When you see, with discernment, all fabrications are inconstant, you grow disenchanted with stress. This is the path to purity. DHP 277. Read that again. The verse does not say, when you see that all things are impermanent, you despair. It does not say, when you understand impermanence, you accept that nothing matters. It says, you grow disenchanted with stress. And it calls this seeing a path, not a dead end, not a counsel of resignation, but a road that leads somewhere. The path to purity. This is the first correction the Buddha's teaching makes to the popular understanding of impermanence. Impermanence is not nihilism wearing robes. It is a doorway. What you walk through it toward is disenchantment. And disenchantment, in the Buddha's vocabulary, is not depression. It is the moment you stop being hypnotized, the moment the spell of permanence breaks and you see what was always already happening. But seeing it requires more than a concept. It requires images precise enough to lodge in the body. In the Anguttara Nikaya, Sutta 7.74, the Buddha tells a story about a teacher named Araka, a teacher who was not Buddhist, who lived in an age when human beings had lifespans of 60,000 years. AN 7.74. Even then, with 60,000 years to spend, Araka told his students that human life was next to nothing, limited, trifling, of much stress and many despairs, and he gave them 7 images for impermanence. We need only 4 of them tonight, but the 4 are enough. The first, a dewdrop on the tip of a blade of grass. When the sun rises, it vanishes. It does not struggle. It does not negotiate. The heat comes, and the dewdrop is simply no longer there. This is impermanence at its most gentle. So gentle you might miss it. Things disappear not with violence but with quiet. The conversation you had this morning is already gone. The light that fell across your kitchen table at 7 a.m. will never fall in exactly that way again. The second, a bubble on the surface of water during heavy rain. It appears. For a fraction of a second, it holds a shape. Round, iridescent, almost beautiful. Then it is gone, not destroyed, simply no longer sustained. The conditions that held it together shifted, and the bubble returned to what it was made of. This is impermanence at the scale of moods, of feelings, of the states of mind you were certain would last and did not. The third, a mountain river, flowing far, its current swift, carrying everything with it. And the sutta says, there is not a moment, an instant, a second where it stands still, but instead it goes and rushes and flows. This is impermanence at the scale of a life. You cannot stop the current. You were never standing on the bank. You were always in the water, moving with it, made of it. The fourth image is different from the others. The others are beautiful. This one is not. A cow being led to the slaughterhouse, with every step of its foot closer to its slaughtering, closer to death. Araka offered this image to people with 60,000 years to live. The Buddha repeated it to monks whose lives were considerably shorter, and neither teacher flinched from what the image means, that the direction of a life is not ambiguous. Every step is a step toward the end of that life, not eventually, not in principle, with every step of its foot. The tenderness of the first three images makes the fourth one land harder. The dewdrop, the bubble, and the river could almost be mistaken for poetry. Beautiful, distant, someone else's impermanence. The cow is not distant. The cow is walking, and so are you. This is where the teaching moves from the head to the chest, and it is where the Buddha, in a different sutta, does something extraordinary with accumulated loss. In the Samyutta Nikaya, Sutta 15.3, called the Asu Sutta, the Discourse on Tears, the Buddha asks a question that, for an audience of a certain age, needs no explanation. N 15.3. Which is greater, the tears you have shed while wandering this long, long time crying and weeping from being joined with what is displeasing, being separated from what is pleasing, or the water in the four great oceans? And he answers his own question. Long have you repeatedly experienced the death of a mother. The tears you have shed over the death of a mother while wandering this long, long time are greater than the water in the four great oceans. He repeats it. The death of a father, of a brother, of a sister, of a son, of a daughter. Loss with regard to relatives. Loss with regard to wealth. Loss with regard to disease. Long have you thus experienced stress, experienced pain, experienced loss, swelling the cemeteries, enough to become disenchanted with all fabricated things, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released. The sutta assumes a framework of rebirth, many lifetimes of accumulated loss. Whether you read this as one long life or many, the Buddha's count holds either way. A person of 65 has already buried parents, perhaps friends, perhaps more, has already watched careers end and marriages change form and bodies become unreliable, has already accumulated enough tears to understand this sutta, not as a doctrine delivered from outside, but as a recognition of something already known from the inside, enough to become disenchanted, enough to become dispassionate, enough to be released. That is the word the sutta uses. Not enough to despair, enough to be released. Impermanence, seen fully, does not imprison. It is the prison door swinging open, if you are willing to stop gripping the bars. 2. Dukkha. What happens when you hold? If anicca describes what the world is, dukkha describes what happens when you try to hold what keeps moving. This is why dukkha sits in the middle of the sequence, not as a separate doctrine, but as a hinge. Impermanence is the observation. Not self is the deepest implication. Dukkha is the mechanism that connects them. The friction generated when a mind that wants permanence meets a world that offers none. We explored dukkha at length earlier in this channel's library. Its 3 layers, its clinical precision, the way the Buddha diagnosed it not as a complaint about life, but as a medical observation about the nature of clinging. What matters here is its position in the chain. Dukkha is not an additional piece of bad news. It is the consequence of misreading the first perception. If you see impermanence clearly, really see it, not just nod at it, dukkha begins to release on its own, not because suffering vanishes, because the clinging that generates suffering loosens its grip. The Dhammapada says it again, in almost identical words. When you see with discernment, all fabrications are stressful, you grow disenchanted with stress. This is the path to purity. DHP 278. The same destination, the same formula. Disenchantment, the path to purity. as if the Buddha is saying, it does not matter which of the 3 doorways you enter. They open onto the same room, but there is a 3rd doorway, the most disorienting, the most contested, and for many, the most liberating of the 3. 3. Anatta, what you are not. Anatta is where most people get lost, and the confusion is understandable because the teaching has been misrepresented so frequently and so confidently that the misrepresentation now circulates more widely than the original. So treaty. 3 corrections before we begin. First, anatta does not mean you do not exist. The Buddha never said that. You are having an experience right now. Something is aware of these words. The teaching does not deny this. Second, anatta is not annihilationism, the view that the self exists now but will be destroyed at death. The Buddha explicitly rejected this view. He called it one of the 2 extremes the middle way avoids. Third, and this is the correction that matters most, anatta is not a metaphysical declaration that there is no self. When a wanderer named Tathāgata asked the Buddha directly, "Is there a self?" the Buddha remained silent. When Tathāgata then asked, "Is there no self?" the Buddha remained silent again. SN 44.10. After Tathāgata left, the Buddha's attendant Ananda asked why he had refused to answer. The Buddha explained, to say there is a self would align with the doctrine of eternalism. To say there is no self would align with annihilationism, and it would have confused Tathāgata further. Didn't I used to have a self? Now I don't. The Buddha did not say there is no self. He said, when examining any aspect of experience, this is not self. The difference between those 2 statements is the entire teaching. This is not self is a surgical tool. You pick it up. You apply it to form. Is this body really me? You apply it to feeling. Is this mood really mine? You apply it to perception, to mental fabrications, to consciousness itself. Each time, the honest answer is the same, not because nothing is there, but because nothing there holds still long enough, or obeys consistently enough to qualify as the permanent, controllable, essential I that the mind insists it is. Here is where 2 of the most respected scholars of Theravada Buddhism part company, and where honesty requires presenting both. Thanissaro Bhikkhu reads anatta as a strategy. In his reading, the Buddha never made an ontological claim about whether a self ultimately exists or does not exist. Instead, he offered not self as a practical tool, a perception you apply to the aggregates in order to stop identifying with them, stop clinging, and stop suffering. Is this constant or inconstant? Inconstant. Then is it fitting to regard it as self? The logic is strategic. If clinging to something as self causes suffering, let go of the label. The question of whether a self really exists is, in Thanissaro's reading, one the Buddha deliberately set aside as unhelpful. This is Thanissaro's interpretive position. It is coherent, well argued, and grounded in specific suttas, but it is not the only reading. Bhikkhu Bodhi and the mainstream commentarial tradition read anatta differently. In their reading, the Buddha is making a truth claim that careful examination of all phenomena reveals the absence of any substantial permanent self, and that this absence is not merely a useful fiction, but a true description of how things are. The aggregates are not self, not just as a matter of strategy, but as a matter of fact. This reading is also coherent, also well argued, and also grounded in the canonical texts. The point on which both scholars agree, and this is the point that matters for practice, is what happens when you apply the not self-perception to experience. Whether you hold that anatta is a strategy or a truth claim, the instruction is the same. Examine form, feeling, perception, fabrications, and consciousness. See that none of them is constant. See that none of them is controllable in the way self implies. And allow the identification to soften. The reduction of clinging, the reduction of suffering, follows from the practice, not from the metaphysics. The Dhammapada offers the third verse. When you see with discernment, all phenomena are not self. You grow disenchanted with stress. This is the path to purity. DHP 279. And here, in this third verse, something shifts in the Pali that most English translations flatten. The first two verses say, Sabbe sankhara, all fabrications, all conditioned things. The third verse says Sabbe dhamma, all phenomena. The term is wider. Fabrications are things that arise from conditions. Phenomena includes everything, conditioned and unconditioned. When the Buddha reached the third perception, he widened the scope. What that widening means, whether all phenomena reaches all the way to Nibbana itself, and what it implies if it does, is a question we will return to before tonight is over. For now, it is enough to notice the shift. The Buddha did not use the same word 3 times. He used a broader word for the third perception, and he did it deliberately. Chapter 4. The lens that reads the map. If you have followed this channel's library from the beginning, something may be happening right now that did not happen when you encountered these teachings individually. The 3 perceptions are not just a teaching among others. They are the lens through which every other teaching becomes legible. Consider what you already know. Dukkha, the subject of an earlier video in this library, is not a standalone complaint about the difficulty of life. It is what happens when a mind that has not seen impermanence tries to live in an impermanent world. The 3 layers of suffering, the suffering of pain, the suffering of change, the suffering of conditioned existence itself, are 3 descriptions of what clinging to the impermanent produces. Remove the misreading of permanence, and the mechanism that generates dukkha begins to slow. Dependent origination, the 12-link chain, is the detailed map of what happens when the 3 perceptions are absent. The chain begins with ignorance, avidya, and ignorance, in the Buddha's usage, is not a lack of information. It is precisely the failure to see anicca, dukkha, and anatta. When you do not see that things change, you fabricate. When you fabricate, you grasp. When you grasp, you become. When you become, you are born into another round of suffering. The 12 links are the machinery that runs when the 3 perceptions are not operating. Turn the perceptions on, and the machinery begins to wind down. Karma, intentional action, is the moment-to-moment activity that either reinforces or corrects the 3 distortions we examined in Chapter 1. Every act of clinging to the permanent, the pleasant, and the mine is a kamic act that deepens the groove. Every act of seeing clearly, impermanent, stressful, not self, is a kamic act that loosens it. Karma is not a cosmic accounting system. It is what you are doing right now with your attention, and whether that attention is operating under the 3 distortions or the 3 perceptions, and the 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, fabrications, consciousness, are the substrate. They are what anicca, dukkha, and anatta are observed in. The aggregates are not abstract categories. They are the texture of every moment of experience. And the Buddha's instruction from the ti-lakkhaṇa sutta forward is to examine each one. Is this constant? Is this controllable? Is this self? The aggregates provide the laboratory. The three perceptions provide the method. If you have not encountered those earlier teachings, nothing I have just said prevents you from following what comes next. The three perceptions stand on their own. That is why the Buddha taught them in a single sitting to 5 monks who had never heard of dependent origination or the formal analysis of kamma. But if you have encountered them, the three perceptions reveal something about the architecture of the Buddha's entire teaching. It is not a collection of separate doctrines. It is one insight, applied at different scales, to different dimensions of experience. The three perceptions are the key that reads the map, which raises a practical question. How do you use the key? The Buddha's answer is not philosophical. It is observational. And the clearest canonical instruction for how to practice the three perceptions comes not from the Satipatthana Sutta, which, despite its fame, contains layers that textual scholars have identified as later additions, but from a sutta whose pedigree is less contested and whose instructions are more precise. In the Anapanasati Sutta, the discourse on mindfulness of breathing, the Buddha describes 16 steps of practice, arranged in 4 tetrads. The final tetrad is where the three perceptions enter. N 118. He trains himself. I will breathe in focused on inconstancy. He trains himself. I will breathe out focused on inconstancy. Then focused on dispassion. Then focused on cessation. Then focused on relinquishment. Notice the verb, trains, not believes, not affirms, not recites. The Pali is sikkati. He trains, he practices, he develops a skill. And the object of the training is not a concept but an observation. You breathe in. You notice, this breath is not the same as the last one. You are not thinking about impermanence. You are watching it happen at the most intimate scale available. The breath entering and leaving your own body. This is the epistemology the Buddha operates from, and it is worth being explicit about it for a Western audience. The Pali verbs for what the three perceptions ask you to do are pasati, he sees, and anupassati, he keeps looking, he observes continuously. They are not sadhati, he believes, he places faith. The Buddha is not asking you to believe that all fabrications are impermanent. He is asking you to look carefully enough to see it, not once as an intellectual recognition, but continuously, anupassati, as an ongoing act of attention. The three perceptions are not articles of faith. They are training instructions for the eyes. This distinction matters especially for the audience this teaching was designed for. Western intellectual culture draws a hard line between belief and observation, between faith and evidence. The Buddha drew the same line. 25 centuries earlier, he did not ask for belief. He asked for sustained, careful looking. And he said that what you see when you look long enough is anicca, dukkha, anatta, a caution here. And I flag it as Thanissaro Bhikkhus because it is his emphasis, though the principle has broader support. The three perceptions are tools, powerful tools, but tools deployed at the wrong moment can do damage. Thanissaro warns specifically against applying the perception of impermanence or not self to your own concentration practice while you are still developing it. If you sit down to meditate, begin to develop some calm and focus, and then immediately turn the perception of impermanence on the calm itself. This is impermanent, this will pass. You undercut the very stability you need in order to see clearly. The tradition calls this the corruptions of insight. Insight applied prematurely, before the mind has developed enough stability to handle what it sees. The three perceptions are meant to be applied to the objects of clinging, the aggregates, from a position of developed calm, not to the calm itself, not while the calm is still fragile. The three perceptions, Thanissaro writes, are basically techniques for letting go of things that don't meet up with the criteria. You apply them to the five aggregates to induce dispassion, so that you can let go of clinging and stop suffering. They are not meant to dissolve everything indiscriminately, including the tools you need for the dissolving. Now, we left a question open in chapter 3. When the Dhammapada presents the three perceptions in verse form, the first two use the phrase sabbe sankhara, all fabrications, all conditioned things. The third uses sabbe dhamma, all phenomena. This asymmetry is real. It is in the Pali, and it has been debated for 2,000 years. The question it opens is this: does all phenomena include the unconditioned, nibbana itself? If so, then anatta applies even to liberation. Even nibbana is not self. You cannot possess it. You cannot claim it as yours. If nibbana is included in sabbe dhamma, then the third perception reaches further than the first two, all the way to the goal of the path itself. Walpola Rahula, Bhikkhu Bodhi, and the mainstream commentarial tradition hold that it does. In their reading, all phenomena are not self means exactly what it says. All phenomena, without exception, including the unconditioned. Nibbana is not impermanent. It does not arise and pass away. Nibbana is not stressful. It is the cessation of stress. But nibbana is not self. It cannot be owned, claimed, or identified with. Liberation is real, but it is not yours. This reading has the virtue of consistency. Anatta applies across the board, without exception. Thanissaro Bhikkhu holds a different view. In his reading, the question, is nibbana self or not self, is malformed. The kind of question the Buddha would set aside rather than answer. Thanissaro points to passages where the canon itself seems inconsistent on whether nibbana qualifies as a dhamma in the technical sense, and to DN 15, where the Buddha says the experience of unbinding lies beyond all designations. In this reading, the categories of self and not self simply do not apply to nibbana. They are tools for disidentification, and when disidentification is complete, the tools are set down. You do not use the raft to cross the river and then carry it on your head. Both readings are named. Both are respected. Both are held by scholars whose lifetimes of careful study command attention. And I will not pretend to resolve tonight what 2 millennia of close reading have not resolved. What I can offer is a formulation that honors both. A formulation grounded in what the texts say, rather than in what the commentaries argue. Nibbana is not impermanent. The texts are clear. Nibbana is not stressful. The texts are clear. Whether nibbana is or is not self, the Buddha refused to answer. Whatever else liberation is, it is not a possession to be claimed by anyone. That much, every school, every scholar, every reading agrees on. Close. The path to purity. There is a passage in the Udana, one of the oldest collections in the Pali Canon, where the Buddha says something that sounds at first like it belongs in a different religion entirely. There is, monks, an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. If there were not that unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, there would not be the case that escape from the born, become, made, fabricated would be discerned, but precisely because there is an unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated, escape from the born, become, made, fabricated is discerned. UD 8.1 4 negations: unborn, unbecome, unmade, unfabricated. Each one is the negation of a characteristic of conditioned existence. Everything you have ever experienced has been born, has become, has been made, has been fabricated by conditions. And the Buddha says, there is something that is none of those things. And it is precisely because that something exists that escape is possible. This is not a promise of heaven. It is not a description of a place you go after death. It is a statement about the structure of reality, that the conditioned does not exhaust what is real, that there is an exit, not from life but from the cycle of clinging, that makes life feel like a trap. The three perceptions point toward this exit. They do not describe it. They cannot, because the exit, by definition, lies beyond the fabricated world that the three perceptions examine. Impermanence describes the conditioned. Unsatisfactoriness describes what happens when you cling to the conditioned. Not self describes the absence of ownership in the conditioned, but the unconditioned, whatever it is where the three perceptions, fully seen, fully absorbed, deposit you when the clinging stops. The Buddha compared his teaching to a raft. You build it to cross the river. When you reach the other shore, you do not strap it to your back and carry it overland. The three perceptions are the raft. They are indispensable for the crossing. They are not the shore. Let us return to where we began. AN 3.136. Whether or not there is the arising of Tathāgatas, this property stands. The Buddha did not create impermanence. He did not invent unsatisfactoriness. He did not fabricate not self. He looked at experience with a steadiness and precision that most minds never achieve, and he reported what he found. Then he taught others how to look. That is all the three perceptions ask of you. Not belief, not conversion, not the adoption of a philosophical position. They ask you to look at your own experience, at form, at feeling, at perception, at the fabrications of your mind, at consciousness itself, and to ask three questions. Is this constant? Is clinging to this easeful? Is this mine in the way I have always assumed? The Buddha already knew your answers. He had heard them from 5 monks in a park outside Varanasi, and from thousands after. The answers are always the same: inconstant, stressful, not fitting to regard as self. But the answers are not the point. The seeing is the point, because the 5 monks did not achieve liberation by giving the correct answers on an examination. They achieved liberation because the questions, asked with enough precision and received with enough honesty, dissolved the clinging that had held them in place. The answers were not information. They were recognition. The Dhammapada gives us 3 verses for the 3 perceptions. Each verse ends with the same 5 words in Pali. Esa maggo visuddhya. This is the path to purity. DHP 277 to 279. Not 3 paths. 1 path entered from 3 directions. See impermanence. This is the path to purity. See unsatisfactoriness. This is the path to purity. See not self. This is the path to purity. The Buddha did not give us 3 facts to memorize. He gave us 3 ways to look at a single experience. The experience of being alive in a world of changing things, clinging to them, and suffering because the clinging cannot hold. He called this looking the path to purity. Not because the world improves when you see it clearly. The world remains what it has always been. Impermanent, stressful for those who grip, empty of a self that was never there to begin with. What changes is not the world. What changes is the one who looks at it, or more precisely, what falls away is the one who was never really looking, the one who was reading permanent where things change, pleasant where things bite, mine where nothing holds still long enough to be owned. The three perceptions do not add anything to your experience. They subtract what was never true. Tonight, if you choose, you can test this for yourself, not as a philosophical exercise, not as a commitment to a tradition, as an experiment, the kind the Buddha himself would have endorsed, because he never asked anyone to take his word for it. Breathe in. Notice that this breath is not the same as the last one. It is not the same temperature, not the same depth, not the same speed. It arose from conditions. It is present for a moment, and it will end. You did not create it. You cannot keep it. And the one who is noticing, look carefully, is also not the same as the one who noticed the last breath. Inconstant, not ownable. And yet, here you are, breathing, aware, able to look. This is the path to purity,